So did everybody believe in witches in Shakespeare's England or King James's Scotland? Perhaps surprisingly, the answer is no. Here in the stacks of the library of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, I've opened up a book called The Discovery of Witchcraft, written by one Reginald Scott, published in 1584. And it's got a rather extraordinary title page. The Discovery of Witchcraft, proving that the compacts and contracts of witches with devils and infernal spirits or familiars are but erroneous novelties and imaginary conceptions. Also discovering how far their power extendeth in killing, tormenting, consuming, or curing the bodies of men, women, children, or animals by charms, philters, periapts, pentacles, curses, and conjurations, wherein likewise the unchristian practices and inhuman dealings of searchers and witch-triers upon aged, melancholy, and superstitious people, in extorting confessions by terrors and tortures, and in devising false marks and symptoms, are notably detected, very necessary to be known for the undeceiving of judges, justices, and jurors, before they pass sentence upon poor, miserable, and ignorant people who are frequently arraigned, condemned, and executed for witches and wizards. So here's Reginald Scott, 1584, saying the idea of witches having contracts with the devils, conjuring up spirits, using their powers to kill and torment men, women, and animals, are entirely tricks, acts of conjuring, fakery, and that it's very necessary for this to be known so that judges and lawyers don't put to death poor, miserable old women who are accused of witchcraft when all they are is poor, old, maybe ugly or unpopular. Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft is an extraordinarily modern text. It shows the rational mind at work, exploding all the old superstitions. It tells you what a lot of those superstitions were, and many of the details that we see in the descriptions of Shakespeare's witches, such as seeing them killing swine, are there in the accounts of the sorts of deeds that women were accused of when they were brought to trial for being witches. But Scott says, no, it's all a fiction. It's not to be believed. Did that then mean that belief in witchcraft began to die out? Well, it's certainly the case that in the later years of Queen Elizabeth's reign, there were very few witchcraft trials, and there does seem to have been a softening of attitudes. Witchcraft was indeed often regarded as what they called a popish imposture, something associated with the old Roman Catholic Church, as opposed to the new doctrine of Protestantism. Things changed, though, when King James became King of England, because James did believe in witches. In 1590, when he was King of Scotland, he had sailed to Denmark in order to meet his bride, and they sailed back together. She was now Queen Anne, daughter of the King of Denmark. And on the way, there was a terrible storm. And there began to be a belief that people were plotting to kill the King and Queen, and they were using witchcraft to do it. And that it was witches who had summoned up the storm. At Berwick-on-Tweed, just on the border between England and Scotland, there was a huge trial, and 300 people were accused of witchcraft. James was absolutely convinced that there were evil spirits and that witches were real. And he rather fancied himself as someone who knew the art of distinguishing between a true witch and a false one. And he actually wrote a treatise about this called Of Demonology, in which he attacked Reginald Scott. When he came to the English throne in 1603, his Demonology was reprinted in London. It had originally been published in Edinburgh. So Shakespeare found himself in the position of writing a play involving witches for a king who took witchcraft very, very seriously. At the same time, James's experience when he was in England was that there was more scepticism about witchcraft. And a lot of people began saying to him that belief in witchcraft was a sign of a primitive society. The implication perhaps being that his Scotland, where witchcraft trials were still common and punishments cruel, was a more primitive place than England. So in some sense, he backed off from his belief in witchcraft. And it may be that what Shakespeare is doing in creating this ambiguity about about whether the witches really are agents of the devil or whether they are the fantastical product of the fevered imagination of Macbeth. Maybe by keeping the question open, Shakespeare is making sure that King James is happy whichever way he wishes to interpret the play. He wouldn't have wanted to say anything that would have alienated the king and patron of his acting company. But one of the reasons that James was committed to the idea that witches were real and that people really could be in compact with the devil was that he also wanted people to believe that good magic was possible. If the magic of a witch was evil, was black magic, involved being in touch with the devil, King James was also a believer in the positive power of magic, a kind of white magic, a sort of magical power that belonged to the king. The king for James was God's representative on earth. He believed passionately in the divine right of kings, that the king somehow had religious powers, was almost godlike. And so it was that King James revived an ancient custom known as touching, whereby people with a disease known as scrofula, which is a kind of skin disease, would be touched by the king and they would be magically cured. This was a belief that went back to the time of Edward the Confessor, the saintly king of England from precisely the time when Macbeth was on the throne in Scotland. And there's a reference to this in the play, which would have been very pleasing to King James. In one crucial scene, towards the end of Macbeth, we move to the English court. We get a contrast between the good court of Edward the Confessor and the bad court of the wicked tyrant Macbeth in Scotland. And this is what we hear about Edward the Confessor. Enter a doctor. Malcolm, who's come to the English court to get assistance in the battle against Macbeth, asks where the king is, what he's doing. And the doctor replies, there is a crew of wretched souls that stay his cure. Their malady convinces the great assay of art. In other words, the art of the doctor can't cure them. But at his touch, the king's touch, such sanctity hath heaven given his hand, they presently amend. What's the disease he means, asks Macduff. It is called the evil, a most miraculous work in this good king, which often, since my here remain in England, I have seen him do. How he solicits heaven himself best knows, but strangely visited people, all swollen and ulcerous, pitiful to the eyes, the mere despair of surgery, he cures, hanging a golden stamp about their necks, put on with holy prayers, and 'tis spoken to the succeeding royalty he leaves, the healing benediction. With this strange virtue he hath a heavenly gift of prophecy, and sundry blessings hang about his throne that speak him full of grace. So here we have an image of the king somehow in touch with heaven and being given this divine power, a power that doctors don't have, to cure this condition, the so-called king's evil, the swollen and ulcerous scrofula, the despair of surgery. It gives healing benediction, and that's a power that is passed on from one king to the next. And with it, says Malcolm, Edward the Confessor allegedly has a gift of prophecy. So it's as if after all those evil prophecies of the witches, here we have a prophecy of goodness, a prophecy of a good king and a well-ruled state. Now, fascinatingly, King James himself believed that he was descended from Banquo. That's why it's important in the play that Banquo's son, Fleance, escapes from the murderers when Macbeth tries to get them both killed. And in the scene where the Weird Sisters return and they show Macbeth a vision of the future kings of Scotland, it is the line of Banquo, the kings descended from Banquo, whom he sees. When that was performed at court, it would be as if the line went right down to the present, and there was King James himself, descendant of Banquo, the king as full of grace, full of the good magic of the cure of the king's evil.